On the morning of October 15th, 1899, the residents of Millhaven village woke to find their crystal-clear mountain river flowing red as fresh blood. By evening, 3 entire families had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only empty homes and unanswered questions. The authorities claimed it was a mining accident, but the truth buried beneath the Appalachian soil would prove far more sinister. Before we uncover the dark secrets of what really happened in Millhaven village that night, I need you to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because stories like this one don't make it into history books. Give this video a like if you're ready to dive deep into one of North Carolina's most disturbing cover-ups. And let me know in the comments what city and country you're watching from. Now let's discover together what the authorities tried so desperately to hide. The events that unfolded in Millhaven village have been passed down through whispered conversations and fragmented memories, and while official records remain suspiciously incomplete, the stories told by the few surviving witnesses paint a picture of corruption and murder that reaches into the highest levels of local authority. Nestled deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of western North Carolina, Millhaven village was a community where time seemed to move slower than the rest of the world. In 1899, barely 300 souls called this remote settlement home, their lives intertwined like the mountain laurel that bloomed each spring along the crystal-clear Millhaven River. The village had been founded in 1847 by Jeremiah Millhaven, a Methodist preacher who believed God had led him to this pristine valley. For over 50 years, families like the Whitmores, Crawfords, and Mackenzies had built their lives around the river that provided everything they needed: fresh water for drinking, power for the sawmill, and fertile soil for their crops. Samuel Whitmore ran the village's only general store, a weathered building where locals gathered each morning to discuss weather, crops, and the occasional piece of news from Asheville, 30 miles away. His wife Martha was known throughout the valley for her healing remedies, made from herbs gathered in the mountain forests. Their 2 children, Rebecca and young Thomas, were among the brightest students in the one-room schoolhouse. The Crawford family had operated the village sawmill for 3 generations. James Crawford, a sturdy man with calloused hands and an honest reputation, employed nearly a dozen men cutting timber from the surrounding mountains. His wife Elizabeth taught at the school, while their teenage son David helped his father with the mill's operations. Then there were the Mackenzies. Robert, a skilled blacksmith whose forge provided tools and horseshoes for the entire region, and his wife Mary, who tended the village's small chapel when the circuit preacher wasn't available. Their daughter Catherine, barely 16, had just become engaged to David Crawford, a union that had brought joy to both families. These families represented the heart of Millhaven village, respected by all and trusted with the community's most important decisions. They served on the village council, organized church functions, and were the first to help when neighbors faced hardship. No one suspected that their dedication to their community would ultimately cost them their lives. The autumn of 1899 had been unusually prosperous for Millhaven. The harvest was abundant, the sawmill was operating at full capacity, and plans were underway for expanding the school. Benjamin Millhaven, great-nephew of the village founder, had returned from his business ventures in Charlotte, bringing promises of modernization and economic opportunity. Benjamin was a sharp-dressed man in his 30s, with the kind of confident smile that made people want to trust him. He spoke of bringing the railroad closer to Millhaven, of establishing new trade routes, and of making their small community a vital part of North Carolina's growing economy. The villagers welcomed him with open arms, grateful to have a Millhaven descendant who understood both their traditions and the changing world beyond the mountains. What they didn't know was that Benjamin had already been quietly purchasing mineral rights throughout the valley, using intermediaries and shell companies to hide his true intentions. While the villagers dreamed of progress, Benjamin Millhaven was planning something far more sinister, The first signs of trouble appeared in early October, though at the time no one recognized them as warnings. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who lived closest to the river's source high in the mountains, complained that her well water had begun tasting strange, metallic and bitter. Her chickens stopped laying eggs, and her vegetable garden, once the envy of the village, began withering despite the mild autumn weather. Samuel Whitmore noted these concerns in his careful records, as he did all matters affecting the community. When James Crawford mentioned that fish were dying in unusually large numbers near the old Beaver Dam, Samuel decided it warranted investigation. He convinced Robert Mackenzie and James to join him for a trek upstream to examine the water source. On October 12th, the three men set out before dawn, following the familiar mountain trail that led to the river's headwaters. What they discovered there would seal their fate and that of their families. Hidden in a secluded valley, barely 2 miles from the village, they found an extensive mining operation that had been cleverly concealed from the main trails. Massive excavation equipment, transported piece by piece up treacherous mountain paths, was systematically stripping away layers of earth and rock. Chemical barrels lined a makeshift facility where workers in protective clothing processed raw ore using methods that filled the air with toxic fumes. The operation was extracting iron ore using a new chemical processing technique that promised higher yields and greater profits than traditional methods. However, the byproducts of this process were being dumped directly into underground streams that fed the Millhaven River. The runoff contained not only heavy metals and industrial chemicals, but also traces of arsenic and mercury that would eventually poison everything downstream. Samuel Whitmore, with his careful merchant's eye for detail, immediately understood the scope of the operation. This wasn't a small, temporary mining venture. It was a massive industrial project designed to strip every valuable mineral from the mountains surrounding their village. The equipment alone represented an investment of thousands of dollars, money that could only have come from outside investors with deep pockets and powerful connections. James Crawford, whose family had worked these mountains for generations, recognized the devastating environmental impact. The mining was destroying not just the immediate area, but threatening the entire watershed that supported communities for miles downstream. The chemicals being used would contaminate the soil and water for decades, making the land unsuitable for farming, logging, or any traditional mountain livelihood. Robert Mackenzie, practical and direct as always, focused on the immediate danger to their families and neighbors. The toxic runoff was already affecting the village's water supply, and if the operation continued, it would only get worse. Children could become sick, livestock would die, and their entire way of life would be destroyed. The three men spent hours documenting what they had found, taking careful notes about the equipment, the chemicals being used, and the obvious environmental damage already occurring. They collected samples of the contaminated water and made detailed sketches of the facility's layout. Most importantly, they identified several of the workers and overheard conversations that revealed the operation was being conducted without any official permits or environmental oversight. As they prepared to leave, Samuel noticed something that chilled him to the bone. Among the workers, he recognized Deputy Sheriff Marcus Webb, a man who was supposed to be protecting the interests of local communities, not participating in their destruction. Webb was not just observing the operation, he was clearly in a position of authority, directing workers and making decisions about the chemical processing. The discovery that local law enforcement was involved in the illegal mining operation transformed their investigation from a simple environmental concern into something far more dangerous. If the deputy sheriff was part of the conspiracy, who could they trust? How high did the corruption reach? And most terrifyingly, what would happen to anyone who tried to expose the truth? As the three men made their way back down the mountain, they didn't notice the figure watching them from behind a stand of pine trees. Marcus Webb had spotted them during their investigation, and he immediately understood the threat they represented to the entire operation. By the time Samuel, James, and Robert reached their homes that evening, their fate had already been decided. The discovery at the mining site created an urgent dilemma for the three families. They couldn't ignore what they had found, but they also understood the danger of confronting such a well-funded and apparently well-connected operation. That evening, Samuel Whitmore called a private meeting at his store, inviting only James Crawford and Robert Mackenzie. Martha Whitmore served coffee and her famous apple cake, but the mood was somber as the men shared their findings with their wives. Elizabeth Crawford, with her teacher's analytical mind, immediately grasped the long-term implications for the children in her classroom. Mary Mackenzie, whose deep faith had always guided her family's decisions, saw the operation as a moral abomination that demanded action regardless of the personal cost. The women's reactions strengthened their husbands' resolve. This wasn't just about their own families. Every child in Millhaven village was at risk from the contaminated water, and every family would eventually suffer as the poisoning spread through the ecosystem. They agreed on a careful plan. Samuel would use his business connections to research Benjamin Millhaven's recent activities and financial backing. James would quietly speak with other mill workers to see if anyone had noticed suspicious activity in the mountains. Robert would examine the village's water supply more carefully and document any signs of contamination. Most importantly, they would compile a comprehensive report of their findings and present it to Circuit Judge Harrison Blackwood during his next visit to the county seat in Asheville. Judge Blackwood had a reputation for integrity and was known to be immune to the kind of political pressure that might influence local officials. Over the next 2 days, their investigation revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Samuel's inquiries in Asheville uncovered that Benjamin Millhaven had received backing from a consortium of investors based in Charlotte and Richmond, men with connections to railroad companies and industrial development projects throughout the Southeast. The mining operation was just the first phase of a plan to transform the entire region into an industrial zone, regardless of the environmental or human cost. James Crawford's conversations with his workers revealed that several had been approached about jobs at a logging operation in the mountains, though the pay was unusually high and the work locations were kept secret. 2 men had taken the jobs and hadn't been seen in the village since, though their families had received money and been told the men were working at a distant site. Robert Mackenzie's examination of the village water supply confirmed their worst fears. The contamination was already measurable in the main river, and trace amounts of toxic chemicals were appearing in wells throughout the village. While not immediately fatal, continued exposure would cause serious health problems, particularly for children and pregnant women. On the evening of October 14th, the 3 families gathered one final time to review their evidence and prepare their presentation to Judge Blackwood. The children played together in the Whitmore's back room while the adults finalized their documentation. Rebecca Whitmore helped Catherine Mackenzie practice her piano pieces for the upcoming church social, while young Thomas Whitmore showed David Crawford his collection of interesting rocks found along the river. It was a peaceful scene that masked the growing danger surrounding them. Unknown to the families, Deputy Sheriff Webb had been watching their activities closely and had reported their investigation to Benjamin Millhaven and his associates. The decision had been made that the threat posed by the 3 families was too great to ignore, and immediate action was necessary to protect the mining operation and the massive financial interests behind it. The families had no idea that their careful investigation had sealed their fate. If you're enjoying this dark tale from the North Carolina mountains, give this video a like and let me know in the comments. Do you think they should have stayed quiet to protect their families, or were they right to risk everything for their community? The answer might surprise you as we discover what happened next. Benjamin Millhaven arrived at the village on the afternoon of October 14th, accompanied by three men he introduced as potential investors interested in local timber resources. The visitors were well-dressed and polite, asking detailed questions about the village's history, its residents, and the surrounding terrain. To most villagers, they seemed like successful businessmen exploring legitimate opportunities. However, Samuel Whitmore noticed several troubling details about the visitors. Their expensive clothes couldn't hide the fact that these men were more comfortable with physical labor than boardroom negotiations. One had scarred knuckles that suggested experience with violence. Another carried himself with the rigid posture of a former soldier, and the third kept checking his pocket watch as if waiting for a specific time. Most disturbing was their intense interest in the three families who had discovered the mining operation. The visitors asked pointed questions about the Whitmore's store inventory, the Crawford sawmill's production schedule, and the Mackenzie blacksmith shop's busiest hours. They wanted to know about family routines, when children walked to school, and which houses were visible from the main road. Benjamin Millhaven himself seemed different from the charming entrepreneur who had won the village's trust just weeks earlier. There was a cold calculation in his eyes as he watched the three families going about their daily routines, and he showed particular interest in the evening meeting at Samuel Whitmore's store. That night, as the families finalized their evidence against the mining operation, they had no idea they were being observed. Marcus Webb had positioned himself and two associates at strategic points around the village, monitoring every movement and conversation. When the meeting concluded and the families returned to their homes, Webb signaled his accomplices that the operation could proceed. The plan was brutally simple but carefully orchestrated to look like a series of unfortunate accidents. The three families would be eliminated simultaneously to prevent any from raising an alarm, and their bodies would be disposed of in a way that supported the cover story of a mining accident that had contaminated the river. At midnight on October 15th, masked men struck all three households simultaneously. The attacks were swift and silent, designed to prevent any screams or calls for help that might alert neighbors. The families were overpowered before they could resist, bound and gagged, then transported to waiting wagons that had been positioned along seldom-used mountain trails. The operation was timed to coincide with the mining facility's most intensive chemical processing cycle. The toxic waste from that night's ore processing would provide the perfect explanation for the river's discoloration, while the remote location ensured that the family's final moments would remain unknown to anyone except their killers. By dawn, the three houses stood empty, their doors left slightly ajar, as if the families had departed hastily. Personal belongings remained undisturbed, meals sat half-finished on kitchen tables, and beds appeared to have been slept in normally. To casual observers, it looked as if the families had simply vanished during the night. The first person to notice the disappearances was young Emily Patterson, who arrived at the Whitmore store expecting to buy supplies for her mother. When she found the store locked and no one responding to her calls, she assumed the family was busy with morning chores and decided to return later. By noon, however, multiple villagers had noticed the unusual absence of all three families. James Crawford's mill workers waited for their boss to arrive and unlock the facility. Mary Mackenzie's usual appearance at the chapel for midday prayers was conspicuously absent. Most alarming, none of the children had appeared for school, and Elizabeth Crawford was nowhere to be found. When concerned neighbors finally entered the empty houses, they discovered the carefully staged scene that supported the official cover story. In each home, they found evidence of hasty departure. Clothes missing from wardrobes, small valuables apparently taken, and notes hastily written suggesting urgent family business requiring immediate travel. The notes found in each house told a similar story: unexpected family emergencies requiring immediate departure to distant relatives in other states. Samuel Whitmore had allegedly received word that his brother in Tennessee was dying and needed immediate assistance with his business affairs. James Crawford had supposedly learned of a lucrative logging contract in Virginia that required his expertise. Robert Mackenzie had apparently been summoned to help his ailing father-in-law in Georgia. To most villagers, the explanation seemed plausible, if unfortunate. Mountain families often had relatives scattered across the southeast, and urgent family business could indeed require sudden travel. The fact that all three families had left simultaneously was unusual, but not impossible, particularly given their close friendship and shared business interests. However, several villagers noticed troubling inconsistencies in the official story. Mrs. Patterson remembered that Martha Whitmore had mentioned just days earlier that all her relatives lived in North Carolina, and she had never spoken of any brother in Tennessee. Tom Bradley, who worked at Crawford's mill, knew that James had recently turned down several out-of-state job offers because he was committed to expanding his local operation. Most significantly, Circuit Minister John Wesley, who knew the religious practices of all three families intimately, found it impossible to believe that they would leave without informing him or making arrangements for the chapel's care. Mary Mackenzie, in particular, had never missed a scheduled service in over 15 years and would never have abandoned her responsibilities without proper notice. When these concerns were brought to Deputy Sheriff Webb, he dismissed them as village gossip and insisted that the family's departures were exactly as the notes described. He claimed to have personally spoken with Samuel Whitmore before his departure and confirmed that the emergency was genuine and required immediate attention. However, Webb's explanation only raised more questions. If he had spoken with Samuel, why hadn't Samuel mentioned the emergency to any of his other friends? Why had none of the families taken the time to collect money owed to them by various villagers? Most puzzling, why had they left behind valuable items that would have been easily transported? The mystery deepened when villagers began noticing the change in the river's color. The water that had run crystal clear for over 50 years was now tinted with a reddish-brown hue that became more pronounced with each passing day. Dead fish began appearing along the riverbank, and livestock that drank from the river showed signs of illness. Deputy Sheriff Webb announced that the river's discoloration was caused by a mining accident upstream, though he provided no details about the nature of the accident or which mining company was responsible. He assured villagers that the contamination was temporary and would clear up within a few days. When the water didn't clear and more fish began dying, concerned villagers demanded more information about the mining accident. Webb's responses became increasingly evasive, and he began discouraging people from investigating the river's source or asking questions about the missing families. The situation reached a crisis point when Dr. Franklin Morrison, the circuit physician who served several mountain communities, arrived for his monthly visit to Millhaven village. Dr. Morrison had been practicing medicine in the region for over 20 years and had extensive experience with mining-related health problems. One look at the contaminated river and the sick livestock told him that this was no ordinary mining accident. The specific discoloration and the pattern of animal deaths suggested exposure to industrial chemicals far more dangerous than anything used in traditional mining operations. When he learned that 3 entire families had disappeared just as the contamination began, Dr. Morrison immediately understood that he was looking at evidence of a major crime. Dr. Morrison's arrival changed everything, but it also put him directly in the path of the same forces that had already claimed 3 families. Just when we think we've seen it all, the horror in Millhaven village intensifies. If this story is giving you the creeps, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Give it a like to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Let's find out together what happens next. Dr. Morrison's investigation began immediately upon his arrival in Millhaven village. His medical training and experience with industrial accidents allowed him to quickly identify the specific type of chemical contamination affecting the river. The reddish discoloration wasn't caused by iron ore, as Deputy Webb had claimed, but by a combination of heavy metals and organic compounds consistent with the new chemical extraction processes being used in large-scale mining operations. More disturbing was his analysis of the dead fish and sick livestock. The pattern of organ damage he observed was consistent with acute poisoning from mercury and arsenic compounds, chemicals that would only be present in significant quantities if someone was using industrial-grade extraction methods without proper waste disposal. Dr. Morrison's most chilling discovery came when he examined water samples under his portable microscope. Mixed with the chemical contamination, he found microscopic traces of organic material that shouldn't have been present in mining runoff. His medical training told him exactly what he was looking at, though he hoped desperately that he was wrong. When Dr. Morrison confronted Deputy Webb with his findings, the deputy's reaction confirmed his worst suspicions. Instead of showing concern about the health implications for the village, Webb became aggressive and demanded that Dr. Morrison leave immediately. Webb claimed that outside interference in local matters wasn't welcome, and threatened to have the doctor arrested for trespassing if he continued his investigation. That night, Dr. Morrison secretly met with several trusted villagers, including Minister Wesley and Tom Bradley from the sawmill. He shared his findings and his growing conviction that the missing families hadn't left voluntarily, but had been murdered to prevent them from exposing the illegal mining operation. The group decided that immediate action was necessary. Dr. Morrison would travel to Asheville and report his findings to federal authorities, while Minister Wesley would contact his church superiors who had connections with state officials. Tom Bradley, who knew the mountain trails better than anyone, would attempt to locate the mining operation and gather additional evidence. Their plan was discovered before it could be implemented. Marcus Webb had been monitoring the doctor's activities since his arrival, and when he learned about the secret meeting, he realized that the conspiracy was about to be exposed. Emergency messages were sent to Benjamin Millhaven and his associates, and a decision was made to eliminate the new threats immediately. However, Dr. Morrison had anticipated this possibility. Before the meeting with the villagers, he had already written a detailed report of his findings and given it to a trusted colleague in Asheville with instructions to contact federal authorities if anything happened to him. He had also hidden copies of his evidence in multiple locations, ensuring that the truth would survive even if he didn't. On the morning of October 20th, Dr. Morrison set out for the suspected mining site, accompanied by Tom Bradley and two other men who were determined to gather definitive proof of the illegal operation. They followed the same trail that the three missing families had taken just over a week earlier, but this time they were prepared for what they might find. The mining facility had been expanded since the family's discovery, with additional equipment and more workers processing ore around the clock. The environmental damage was even more extensive, with toxic runoff creating dead zones throughout the surrounding forest. Most horrifying of all, they found evidence of recent burials in a secluded area near the chemical processing site. The graves were crude and hastily dug, barely concealing the remains of the three families who had threatened to expose the operation. The bodies showed signs of violence, confirming that the Whitmores, Crawfords, and Mackenzies had been murdered rather than accidentally killed in a mining accident. Dr. Morrison's group also discovered that the red discoloration in the river wasn't just caused by chemical runoff. The killers had deliberately dumped the family's bodies into the chemical processing pools, allowing their blood to mix with the toxic waste before it flowed downstream into the Millhaven River. The symbolic horror of this act, turning the life-giving waters of the village red with the blood of its most respected families, was designed to send a message to anyone else who might consider interfering with the operation. Armed with undeniable evidence of mass murder and environmental destruction, Dr. Morrison's group prepared to retreat and alert the authorities. However, they had been discovered by mine security, and a deadly chase began through the treacherous mountain terrain. The chase through the Appalachian wilderness lasted through the night of October 20th and into the following morning. Dr. Morrison and his companions used their knowledge of local terrain to evade capture, but they knew their pursuers wouldn't give up easily. Too much money and too many powerful reputations were at stake. Tom Bradley, with his intimate knowledge of the mountain trails, led the group through a series of hidden paths that eventually brought them to the main road leading to Asheville. Dr. Morrison's advanced planning proved crucial. His colleague had already alerted federal authorities when the doctor failed to arrive as scheduled, and a team of federal marshals was en route to investigate. The federal intervention came just in time. When the marshals arrived in Millhaven village, they found Deputy Webb attempting to destroy evidence and intimidate potential witnesses. Benjamin Millhaven and his associates had already fled, but they left behind a paper trail that would eventually lead to their capture and prosecution. The full scope of the conspiracy was revealed during the subsequent investigation. The mining operation was backed by a consortium of wealthy investors who had planned to strip mine the entire region, regardless of the environmental or human cost. They had corrupted local law enforcement and were prepared to eliminate anyone who threatened their profits. The three families, the Whitmores, Crawfords, and Mackenzies, had been murdered not just to silence them, but to send a message to the entire community. Their blood had been deliberately mixed with the chemical runoff to create the Red River that gave the incident its name, a grotesque warning of what would happen to anyone else who dared to interfere. The legal proceedings that followed exposed corruption reaching into the highest levels of county government. Several officials were arrested and prosecuted, while the mining consortium faced federal charges for environmental destruction and conspiracy to commit murder. Benjamin Millhaven was eventually captured in South Carolina and sentenced to death for his role in orchestrating the murders. However, the victory came too late for the families who had paid the ultimate price for their courage and integrity. Samuel and Martha Whitmore, their children Rebecca and Thomas, James and Elizabeth Crawford, and their son David, Robert and Mary Mackenzie, and their daughter Catherine, all had been murdered for the simple act of trying to protect their community. The Millhaven River eventually ran clear again, but the village never fully recovered from the trauma of that terrible October. Many families moved away, unable to live with the memories of what had happened. The remaining residents established a small memorial where the three houses had stood, honoring the families who had sacrificed everything to protect their neighbors. The tragedy of Millhaven village stands as a stark reminder that evil often wears a familiar face and that courage can be found in the most ordinary people faced with extraordinary circumstances. The three families died because they refused to remain silent when confronted with injustice, and their sacrifice ultimately saved their community from even greater devastation. What do you think about this story? Do you believe that Samuel, James, and Robert made the right choice, even knowing the terrible cost? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to hear more stories about ordinary people who stood up to corruption and paid the ultimate price, subscribe to our channel, hit that notification bell, and share this video with someone who appreciates real stories of courage and sacrifice. Until next time, remember that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how deep it's buried. The red waters of October 1899 flowed into history, carrying with them the memory of three families whose love for their community cost them everything, but whose courage ensured that the truth would eventually see the light of day.